Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. My guest today, unlike me, can actually sing and be, entertaining. My guest is Lois DeArmond, and welcome, Lois.
Thank you.
While we were chatting before this, you were talking a little bit about how the Briton Ensemble got started. So if you could repeat that.
Well, what I mostly did at the fair was that I was a singer. I had never really sung in public before on a stage. And the word went out in 1980 at workshops that Mitchell Sandler, who was the music director of the fair at that time, wanted a group to be the Chapel Royale, were the Queen's madrigal singers. He wanted an in-house madrigal group. So I heard about it from another friend and I went along because I'd always liked to sing and I'm very interested in early music. And so I knew a lot of it in my head. I just never performed it. So based on who turned up at this audition, people who had either not sung before, not sung for a long time, maybe sung in high school, in glee clubs, things like that, we ended up putting together a madrigal group. We had to put a stage show together in 2.5 weeks. And Mitchell decided to kind of change his vision of the group. He wanted us to wear choir robes and travel around with the court all the time. And we didn't want to do that. We had nice costumes, so we didn't wear choir robes. So he turned the group over to James Hendricks, who was also one of the people who came to the audition and had quite a lot of experience with choral work in his college days and high school, and has, a music education. So that's how the Briton Ensemble was born. We were called the Chapel Royale for a couple of weeks, and then we changed our name to the Briton Ensemble, Briton being James's middle name, and continued to be that for several years.
I'm sort of amazed that you had the courage to audition for a choir without or did you have a lot of musical background in your life or family before you went to the Briton Ensemble auditions?
I was amazed too. No one was more amazed than I. And I'm not quite sure why I did it, but I had always sung a little bit my whole life, church choirs a little bit. My dad and I always sang Handel's Messiah at Christmas with community groups. And like I mentioned before, I was very interested in early music and Renaissance music and had a vast collection of records of that music. And at that time, I learned music by ear, just singing along with recordings, because at that time I couldn't read music. So luckily, someone turned up at the audition who was a good sight reader. So she and I made a section. I could not have done that had it not been for her. And she is to this day one of my best friends in the world.
What's her name?
Lori Altman.
I'm going to go back a little bit. Do you remember your first experience at fair and who was the person who said to you, there's this thing called fair, let's go check it out?
Well, the first time I ever heard about the fair was when I was in high school from an art teacher. He told us about it, and he used to go to the fair dressed as a warlock. But I never went. I always thought it sounded interesting, but I never got there. And the first time I ever went, I went with a boyfriend at the time in 1972 and dressed up. I was just so enchanted and blown away by it. And one of the most amazing things to me was, there's bagpipers here. Oh my God. So that was what drew me to it. My first friends at the fair were the pipers who played with Clan Collin, Peter Kapp, John Krieger, and Alan Keith.
Did you join Clan Collin soon thereafter? Or
I did. Yeah, I did. I hung out with them and just kind of became part of that group. And that's what I did. That was in, I'd say, 75-ish. That was my group until 1980 when the Briton Ensemble was formed.
What would have your life been like if you had never done fair? Or what did you see yourself doing sort of that first morning before you went to fair?
At that time, I was a textile designer and I was working for menswear, designing prints. And what I really wanted to do was work on movies, costuming for movies. That was very hard to break into. It took me years, but I did. And that was my career later on. But I don't know what my life would have been like, because virtually everything I do now and everyone I know now stems from being at the fair. It was a moment in time that we were so blessed to be part of.
You mentioned that you're thinking of becoming a movie costume designer. Talk about ping-ponging between the industry and the fair.
Well, the fair in the 80s, the costume department was concerned with historical accuracy as much as they could be at the time. We did the best we could with the information that we had at the time. Now there's much more known about historical clothing in the Elizabethan times. We were functioning on the scholarship of the time. I personally was never a court person, so I didn't get that involved in the historical accuracy. I always dressed as a middle-class person, and that's what our group dressed as. And in terms of the entertainment industry, rarely in this country is anyone concerned with historical accuracy, which
What
is
are they
frustrating.
concerned with?
Looking sexy. You know, women always have to have their hair down, and drives
Were
me
you
crazy.
in the costume shed the same time Chris Seda was there?
I never worked in the costume department, but
Okay.
yes, she and I were there at the same time. Yes.
Because I remember Chris, a very nice person.
Yes.
Her incredible enthusiasm. And also, I remember her concern for periodness. When I still go to the fair as a customer, I still feel a vague sense that I should wear a hat.
Yes.
And that's something that I attribute to Chris.
Yeah. Well, their mandate was that we were an educational organization, and rather than just entertainment, we were trying to teach people history as it was known at the time. Yes, there was a care for all of that came from Phyllis.
Did you ever meet Phyllis?
Oh, sure.
Do you remember her ever saying why we were doing this kind of thing, or her vision or that kind of thing?
She never said that to me, so no. But I've certainly heard it and read it.
Right.
And other people teaching what she taught and caring about what she cared about. And there are people who still do.
Which is a nice thing.
Which is a nice thing.
When you've worked in the industry, what lessons did you learn at fair that helped you sort of break into Hollywood?
This is kind of convoluted, but there was one particular thing. I was asked to do research on how to destroy a costume without harming the person in it.
Okay. Can you share us the name of the movie or TV show that you?
No, at fair.
Oh, okay. Who was the lucky actor? Or
can't say.
Okay.
Can't say. So I knew some people at Western Costume, and I went in there and I asked, and they thought about it and gave me a name, and I contacted that person and I met with that person. And through that person, because it was when I met with him about this particular thing, it was, oh, and by the way, can I show you my portfolio while I'm there? And that silly fair thing is how I met. And this is what I mean about everything I do now, everybody I know now, everything I've done for the past, 35 years came from that silly thing. And I met this guy who was a big time costumer, and he was gracious and gave me names of other people to call and call this one. And how you get jobs is by networking.
Right.
Then as now. And so that started the whole thing. Does that make sense?
It does. What was the point in your life you looked at a costume and said, that's what I want to do with my life? I want to make those.
Well, I was interested in costume when I was a child. I always loved that. And my mother taught me to sew when I was probably 10 or 11. And I used to make most of my own clothes when I was in junior high and high school. And I went to art school for illustration. I thought I was going to be a fashion illustrator. One of the classes I had in art school was the history of costume. And that became my favorite thing. I loved that so much. It was my favorite class I ever had through the whole thing. It wasn't necessarily that I wanted to make them. See, in those days, if you wanted a costume, you had to make it yourself because there wasn't the internet and there wasn't any way to find somebody else to do it for you. So that's why we made our own clothes in those days. It wasn't that particularly that we loved it, although I did enjoy it. And I made just countless costumes for myself and others. In the early 80s, I must have done nothing else. When I look back at the photos of those days, I must have done nothing but make costumes.
Because there was a Renaissance fair, you made a lot of Renaissance costumes.
Yes.
Is there another period that if there had been a Roman Senate Days fair, would you have gotten into togas and
No, that period doesn't interest me.
which period interests you?
Renaissance has always been my favorite period with music, with costume, architecture. Medieval and Renaissance architecture is just my favorite thing. I'm also a big architecture buff. Because we did the Dickens Fair and we did Dickens Christmas caroling, the Briton Ensemble, I've also made quite a lot of that kind of stuff. I like 18th century costumes. I'm very drawn to that look, but there's nowhere to wear that stuff. It's, so there's no point in putting all the work into it because there's nowhere to wear it.
I know this is an unfair question, but do you have a favorite costume that you've ever made, either for yourself or for somebody else?
My favorite costume that I ever made for someone else was for Lisa Emmons. She played the herald's trumpet in the parades, and she also played bagpipes and Breton wind instruments. Yeah, I made her one probably around 1982, and that was a cracker, let me tell you. It was just the best.
What in particular stood out about that costume that made it memorable?
Well, I put a lot of work into the details of it. The colors, it was forest green and burgundy. And she also did silver work, and she made the silver Celtic hooks. And it fit her like a glove. It looked exactly like I wanted it to look. It looked perfect. I made so many costumes in 1982. 1982 was kind of the best year ever for me and for a lot of people that I mentioned it to. Southern Fair and Northern Fair. I mean, Black Point was just magic that year. And I made tons of costumes in the time between Southern Fair and Northern Fair that year.
You mentioned you sang with your dad at Christmas time. In general, even though it was later in your life, did you get the impression that your folks liked fair?
My mother loved it. I don't think my dad ever came. I think it was a little too physical for him getting around there. Maybe he came. I think they both came one time. He kind of didn't like the bawdiness of it. Our stage show was a little bawdy because that's what you needed to do. And he kind of didn't approve of that. But my mother loved it. She and I came together a couple of times before I got involved in a group.
Did she ever help work on your costumes?
No.
That was your thing.
That was my thing. And I just figured stuff out. I would look at something and, like I said, in those days, there were not period patterns that you could buy easily. You just had to figure it out. And even though I'm a costume illustrator, I never did that for my own costumes. I never drew anything first. What I would generally do is collect a lot of fabrics and trims and things that I liked and just kind of set them out around me and put something together. Before I got involved with the fair, I was involved with the SEA. I made some upper class costumes for that. They weren't historically accurate, but they were that sort of fabrics and that sort of cut. Yeah. And I knew nothing. I was just making stuff up. I was just learning as I went along. But no, what I made for the fair, for myself and for others was merchant class costumes.
I was a peasant, so I would wear like a shirt and basically tights and slops and call it done. And then I would look at the middle class people and go, how in the heck are they still upright and conscious because it was so hot? Were there any costume to make it feel cooler than it actually appeared to be?
Not much. With me, as long as I don't have something up around my neck, I can feel cooler. So I would have my shirt would be partially open and bosom exposed partially. If I don't have something uptight around my neck, that's helpful for me. And also on hot days, and this is where you find out whether your lining is color fast or not, you basically put ice down your bodice.
When you're a happy peasant, you could just take a tankard of water and pour it over you and call it done. But
no, when you're dressed a little more formally and you're in a boned bodice, there's not a lot you can do. But ice you can do.
Switching back to the Briton Ensemble, I've heard a lot of madrigal groups give very unified productions, but at the same time, with the Briton Ensemble, you all have your own costumes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
there's not like a corporate look for the Briton Ensemble.
No.
And I really, really like the individuality of the individual costumes. Was that a conscious choice that was made, or just a happy accident? Or
well, in a way, it was a happy accident. Especially during the second year we were together, we changed personnel a little bit. Some new people came in, and most of them happened to be excellent costume makers.
mm-hmm.
So we had really good look. People cared about looking good and made the effort, put the time and money into making beautiful costumes. And yes, we always had our individual personalities in the group. You can blend your voice without obliterating your personality. I'll put it that way.
Well, I think that is very much a strength of James and the Briton Ensemble. I mean, you do a Christmas show and it's basically a Dickens fair kind of look you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
The costumes are just very individually distinctive. And when you're on stage, you can tell that the people are all the members of the ensemble, their personality is reflected in their costume. That really comes across as a very strong theatrical part of the experience of watching you guys, if that makes sense.
Again, it's creating a blended sound while retaining individual personality and performance style. Some people are animated when they perform, some people are not, and that's fine. It's that kind of a group.
Do you sort of have a performance persona that you either acquired at the fair or with the Briton Ensemble?
I did have at the fair, and as I said earlier, if anybody was to tell me before I started doing that I would ever be doing it, speaking aloud to people on stage, saying lines, making things up, ad-libbing lines, interacting with other group members and the audience, which is what you have to do on stage at the Renaissance Fair. I would never have thought I could do that, but I can, and I did, and I still do. I'm not as quiet as you might think.
Okay. Have you ever gone into a, say, Hollywood meeting with your portfolio under your arm and said, I've sung in front of 600 people in front of hay bales. So talking to these 5 people about my portfolio should be a piece of cake. So have you used the experience of being a fair improv performer in your other life as a costume designer / illustrator?
Yes, probably. It gives one more confidence. I have always thought of myself as a shy person. I don't think of myself that way anymore. When I was growing up and when I was younger, I did. In those days, in order to get jobs, you had to cold call people to look at your portfolio. And I just would rather be boiled in oil than call somebody I don't know. But somehow I made myself do it. And now it's easier to do it. I'm much more outgoing than I used to be. Part of it is, I think that just comes with being older and you're not so worried about what people think of you when you're older. But yes, I think that performing in general gives one more confidence in other parts of life.
I learned as a performer at fair is that people want you in general to do well.
Yes.
People are happy to see you. They want you to do well. They've come out, paid $20 or whatever, get in there. And if you come up and say, God ye good den, or may I help you today? By and large, they're going to smile and play along. And that's something you learn at fair.
Yeah. Now, I must say, in those days when I was much younger, I was reluctant to do, street improv, things like that. I wasn't good at that. I was fine on the stage, but when I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. But it's true that people are on your side when they're there. The audience is on your side. They didn't come there to give you a hard time or have a complain and throw things at you.
Do you remember a time going into a production meeting where you were conscious of the fact that you were reaching to people on a fair basis, minus the fair accent?
No, I can't say that I ever had that consciousness. Because I was an illustrator, my selling point of myself was my artwork that spoke for itself and spoke for me.
Could you sketch quickly while interviewing or talking to somebody?
I can do that
Mm-hmm.
if I have to. Yeah. That's one of the ways that I worked with costume designers as their illustrator or their assistant, was to just have them talk to me. And I would say, you mean like this? And yes, I can draw that way. I mean, drawing is communication.
Right.
Because my work is very detailed and very realistic. And one of the things that my work was used for was for the people who are making the costumes to know what to make. And because I understand cut and drape and how costumes are made, my artwork tells the cutter fitter exactly how to make it. I put the seams in. I show the back. Tailors love that.
Who picks the colors? I've been told there's 100 shades of green. And if the designer says, I want that green, and you're sketching something that's green, and the fabric person picks out a green, how does that all get mediated? Has been your experience?
Well, it's the costume designer's decision at first. I'm also one of the people that goes out and finds the fabric. If we can't find it, we have it dyed. But ultimately, then it's the director's call whether they are going to like that. There's a lot of people involved in getting a costume in front of a camera.
Are techniques that you use to create a fair performance useful in creating a consensus on a Hollywood project?
Not really. It's apples and oranges, because when you're working on a movie or a TV show, you're an employee, it's a business, and you're hired to do a certain thing, and you just hope that you will be able to do it to your standards. That's really one of the big challenges in working on movies, or I think any other creative endeavor that is also a business. The clash of art and commerce.
Have you ever worked on a movie project that came close to approximating the feel of working on a fair project?
I would say a couple of them. I worked on a Western called Wild Bill in 1994. It was about Wild Bill Hickok, and we just did the most incredible work. The costume designer allowed me and encouraged me to do what I'm good at. And that is unfortunately not common. Besides being a good costume illustrator, I'm also a good assistant. I'm good at working with vendors, getting things made. I'm good at finding fabrics and just the right trims and buttons and just being out and about, finding the stuff to put the costumes together and working with the cutters. I just had the most fabulous time doing that. It was a joy. It was so hard. It was such hard work because there were all these projects within the projects and they came right after the other and there was no respite between them. They were like, there was a wedding and a circus parade and a, Broadway show and but I would wake up at 3 a.m. going, oh my God, how's this all going to get done? But it did. It was just such a brilliant experience. Nobody ever saw the movie because the studio didn't understand it and didn't know what to do with it, but it was a wonderful experience. And then I also got to work on The Patriot, which is a Revolutionary War movie. We got to do some good work in that. It's really gratifying when you work really hard and then you go and see the movie and you can see every single thing you did on the screen.
This question might highlight my ignorance, so feel free to poo-poo it. But when I think of Western costumes, I think of guys in Levi's on horses. And when I think of fair costumes, I see how you can have an attention to detail that would be rewarded. How would working on a Western reward your interest in detail?
Well, those costumes, especially for Jeff Bridges as Wild Bill, were very detailed. And there were no Levi's. That movie took place in the 1870s. We had to do, I don't remember how many changes he had, but all of his coats were different. All of his pants were different. We had to make boots for him. We made hats for him. All that stuff has to be made. And the women's costumes, all that had to be designed and made. We did Buffalo Bill because there was a sequence, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. We had to make all that stuff, all that embroidered leather and foot-long fringe. And we did all that. And that's the detail.
If you had your choice of any movie genre to do, what genre would you select?
I've never been able to work on a Renaissance movie. All that stuff is done in Europe. So probably I would love to do that. But I very much enjoyed working on The Patriot, 18th century costumes. And I will say that when we started that, we all had to hit the ground running, learn about 18th century costumes because none of us knew anything about it. And I very much like working on Westerns. I understand those clothes really well. I know where to get the things and how they go together and what to do, how to do that. And the designer that I worked for several times, I understood what he wanted and always was able to come up with it. I really enjoy working on Westerns.
When you were kind enough to say, sure, let's do this, was there a story in your mind that you said, I have to be sure to remember to talk about fill in the blank? Do you have a fill in the blank moment that we haven't gotten to?
When you first asked me about, mentors and things like that, I thought, oh my God, I don't know. But I actually could answer that question now.
Okay, please do.
Okay. So because I was involved in the SCA for a little while before I got involved in the Renaissance Fair, I was lucky enough to meet Kathy Lear. And Kathy was very prominent in court and in court dance and costume. And I learned loads from her. She was amazing. And when she passed away a few years ago, some of her costumes and effects were sold at a costume yard sale. And I have her hat. And I treasure her hat very much because I was very fond of her. In terms of performing, because of the kind of music that I like, as well as Renaissance music, I was very much into English traditional music, folk music. And I had a trio for a while in those days called Hot Air. And we used to do that kind of music, English, Irish, Scottish, traditional music. So my mentors and people I looked up to madly for that were Oak, Ash, and Thorn and Briar Rose at the fair.
Right. Do you remember looking say at an oak, ash, and thorn show and saying, I like that, and then later incorporated it into your act?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. We had their songbooks. I loved their harmonies, their sound, the tightness of the arrangements. Absolutely. They and we and all of us who were interested in that kind of music, Vitamins Fancy, Oak Ash and Thorn, Briar Rose, all of us were drinking from the same well because there was a big English traditional folk music revival starting in the 60s and still going on at that time, 70s. We all listened to those folks and took our inspiration from them.
One of the things that Mark and myself and some of the Reduced Shakespeare Company people had to deal with was sort of the balance between being period and being accessibly entertaining to a modern audience. Where do you come down on that spectrum?
Though I never was adamant about speaking pure BFA, and our group didn't really do that. Our stage shows were scripted for the most part. So we did speak in Elizabethan language, but not so that we couldn't be understood. We weren't academic about it. We tried to be entertaining about it. Although I personally hate cheap laughs.
Right.
I don't go along with the anything for yucks kind of shows. I hate that, but that's just me. There are a lot of people at the fair who don't agree with that, and there were people in our group who didn't agree with me on that.
One thing I like about the performance sort of milieu of fair is that it invites people to play with you. When I go to fair these days, I still find people doing the same bits that Mark and myself were doing 40 years ago.
Mm.
And sort of silly teenagers just sort of figuring out, just having fun in a theatrical way. I just kind of go, "Aw, isn't that nice?" And I had one of these interviews with Judy Corey, and she was talking about this living theater movement from the early 1960s, and to see
Yeah.
it sort of still manifesting with a lot of people who have never heard of Phyllis Patterson or Judy Corey or the Reduced Shakespeare Company or the Briton Ensemble, doing sort of the same things and getting the same reactions. I just find that a kind of cool thing.
Yeah. The continuity of that, it's interesting and it's gratifying. Clicking back to your description of the guy with the mic, that's somebody who's totally lacking in wit. And what we had in those days with Reduced Shakespeare and the other people that were on stage doing those shows was incredible wit and intelligence. And that's what made it funny.
And there was this whole world created around it with everybody contributing to it, which sort of self-reinforced the whole look and sound and feel of the fair. Anyways, as we've gone through this, have you thought of any other, oh, by the way, this was really neat about fair kind of stories?
Well, personally, I can say, and other people have said this, the fair was the first place I ever was where I didn't feel like a Martian. I felt like I belonged there. It's where I was supposed to be. These are my people. These people are doing what I want to be doing. And I have never before that or since found a place like that. But it did help me to identify when I was in other places that I could be not a Martian in those places too. Does that make sense?
That made perfect sense. And I think that's a perfect way to bring this conversation to a conclusion. Okay?
Okay.
That's my July 2023 interview with Lois DeArmond. Questions or comments to Lois can be directed to her through me at djng@earthlink.net. Someone you know, or if you would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, you can contact me at djng@earthlink.net. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye, and see you next time.